Volunteer Canada, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, The Volunteering Lens of COVID-19, some data highlights. Very, very pleased to be co-hosting this with the Volunteer Management Professionals of Canada and to present research that was done in collaboration with Ipsos Public Affairs. We are also very appreciative of Employment and Social Development Canada for having supported some of this research. We also want to acknowledge that Statistics Canada last week did release some data on the General Social Survey of Giving, Volunteering and Participating and provided some excellent background data that we reviewed last week. So without further ado, I'm going to proceed to share with you a little bit about how we're proceeding today. We have our welcome and introductions, and you will meet our presenters in a few minutes. We'll have some survey highlights on the questions, results of the survey that was filled out by organizations to get the organizational experience. Then we'll have an opportunity for reflections. We'll have the survey results from the volunteer experience and then some questions and answers. We've been really overwhelmed and pleased with the response. We have well over 225 people joining us today, so we'll have to stay muted, but questions can be asked in the chat function and we will do our best to answer them. We'll stop partway through at the reflections to ask if you have any questions or clarifications, and then we'll do the same at the end. But most importantly, we always consider these webinars to be the beginning of an important conversation that we will continue to convene and have with you in the coming weeks and months. So for those of you that don't know Volunteer Canada, our vision is involve Canadians, resilient communities, and a vibrant Canada. And we work with over 200 local volunteer centers around the country. And in our role, we provide national leadership and expertise on volunteer engagement to enhance the participation, quality, and diversity of volunteer experiences to build strong and connected communities. So with that, I'd like to introduce Diana from Ipsos, who's going to be taking us through the data that was gathered on organizations and their experience with volunteer engagement during this time. Diana, over to you, and please introduce yourself in more detail.
Oh, thank you. My name is Diana McDonald, and I'm a director at Ipsos Public Affairs, and I've been working in the market research industry for over 30 years and have been managing or directing projects for the last more than 20 years. So it's been a long time, and I really do appreciate being able to present these results for the survey of organizations. So the next few slides will show you some of the key findings from the survey of organizations. Ipsos conducted the survey among nonprofit organizations and charities to gather data on whether they had made changes to their organization in response to COVID, the challenges they face, the impact of COVID on volunteering, the type of engagement they were conducted with their volunteers, particularly those volunteers who could not volunteer during COVID. We looked at virtual volunteering, the actions of their stakeholders, the supports and the resources they needed, and their future plans. We go to the next slide. Sorry, one before that. Yeah, so the organizational survey was based on a 15-minute survey conducted among 321 nonprofit organizations and charities in Canada. The surveys were conducted online via an open link. And what happened was that Volunteer Canada sent out the open link to its members and also requested its partners to share the link with their member organizations. The survey was conducted between May 27 and June 12th of this year. And you may notice that in the slides for the organizations and for volunteers, that the numbers may not add up to 100%. And that is due to rounding or because the question itself was a multi-select question, and respondents were permitted to give more than one response. So that results in us not being able to make it add up to 100%. So in terms of the profile of the organizations, we see that we had representation from smaller and bigger organizations. For example, in terms of the operating budget, we had representation from organizations that have under 50,000 operating budget, right up to organizations with 10 million or more operational budget. In terms of, we also had representation from smaller organizations with few employees under 10 and 250 or more, having volunteers, having 20 or fewer volunteers, to up 500 or more. And we also got representation across Canada. The next slide. We also, in terms of who actually responded to the survey, we got representation from different people from different roles in their organization, but most came from full-time paid volunteer managers or executive leadership staff. At the end of the survey, we actually asked a question on the impact of COVID on work life and the workplace. And what we found, we asked them what were they currently experiencing and what they thought they would experience 3 months from now. And we found that the most mentioned challenges or impacts were the same, whether it was current or in the next 3 months. And that was, my duties have changed or will change, or my workload has increased or will increase. Now, we did see that there were fewer people in the next 3 months said that other organizational staff or other volunteer engagement staff would be laid off. But there was an increase in the number in the next 3 months who said they're concerned about the security of their job. So we can go to the next slide. So we started the survey by asking organizations, since the pandemic had started, did they have, what kind of impacts they had in terms of their organization's programs, services, activities, or events. And what we saw was that almost all organizations said they saw all or some of their programs, services, organizations, activities, or events were suspended, postponed, or canceled, or that activities involving in-person contact were canceled or reduced. But we did find some resiliency in terms of these organizations, where we had 8 in 10 who said all or some of their programs, services, activities, or events transitioned to virtual, or that they continued by modifying to lower touch or increased health and safety practices. And in fact, 46% said that they, all or some of their programs were they actually increased or expanded them. In terms of changes to volunteer roles that they experienced due to COVID, 51% said that they transitioned some roles to virtual and online representation. And 40% said they suspended all volunteer engagement until further notice. And what we find is, and another 40 said they reduced some of their the number of their volunteer roles. But we do see that, and another 4 in 10 say they have developed or are developing new volunteer roles. We can go to the next survey. So then we also asked a question, is asking organizations to what degree their organization experienced various challenges. And the number one challenge they faced was that their staff were providing services with fewer volunteers. They also found that difficulty in finding time to develop new roles, descriptions, to transition their volunteers to virtual roles, and that they had too many volunteer applications. They had difficulty to plan, recruit, train volunteers while providing services, or difficulty providing training and support for volunteers to work remotely, and difficulty adapting and delivering volunteer orientation and training. We can go to the next slide. So what we asked them is, what was the impact of COVID on volunteering? And we found that 51% of organizations that responded to the survey said the number of people contacting them to volunteer had declined compared to March 2019. 2 in 10 said it had increased, and 24% said there was no change. Among those who found a decline in volunteers, the #1 reason was that programs, services, or events were suspended or postponed, and there were no other available volunteer roles. 56% said their organizational decision not to engage or volunteers during this time. However, sizable proportions also talked about how volunteers made that decision not to volunteer because of age or health concerns, and that some volunteers were unable to engage in virtual roles. When we looked at the impact of this decline in volunteers on the delivery of their programs and services, we find a similar number say it was a great deal or some impact, 36%, as say there was lesser or no impact at all at 34%, and 25% were in the middle. We go to the next slide. So when we asked organizations about the percentage of volunteer roles which were, are, or will be virtual or done remotely, we found that 53% provided percentages, 27% said they didn't know at this time, they couldn't tell us, and 20% said none of their roles could be virtual because their programs and services cannot be done virtually or remotely. Among the 53% who did give us a percentage, 12% said that the percentage of volunteer roles were virtual prior to COVID-19. And this spiked up to 52% during COVID, but it pretty much stayed the same when we asked them about what they anticipate the number would be within the next 3 months. And we can go, and what we do find that similar kind of numbers in the, for other organizations, that it's over 50% that said from other surveys that were done by Imagine Canada, they had over 54% that said they were going to move to virtual roles for their volunteers. So then we looked at how are they planning their next phase of operations? What have they done? And we find that most, 58%, say they're actively planning their next steps. Another 18% say they have a plan in place for the next phase of their operations. But 2 in 10 still say they're just thinking about these next steps, and 5% are unsure. You can go to the next. And then we ask them, what do they need? What is critical to their organization in the next 6 to 12 months? And we find the top answer is determining if the adaptations they've made to programs or services during COVID should be maintained or changed, whether they're planning for the next wave of the pandemic. And a number of these are related to their volunteers, is keeping their previous volunteers engaged, that is those volunteers who are unable to volunteer during COVID, planning for re-engaging their volunteers, re-engaging returning volunteers, and also estimating the risk or the insurance or the legal considerations. We can go to the next slide.
All right, Diana, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to hear from the researcher herself what the results are and the interpretation. And Ruth, I'm really pleased to welcome you to give some thoughts and reflections on what you've heard as your contact with the Volunteer Management Professionals of Canada and all your members across the country. At the same time, I encourage everybody who has a question, a thought, wanting clarification, please put that in the chat box and we'll entertain those in just a moment. Over to you, Ruth.
Thanks, Paula. Happy to join on the call, and thanks for Diana for laying it all out. Very nicely done, and a lot of information, and a lot of information to absorb at this time. So glad that it's actually going to be recorded so that people can go back and review it, and also really reflect on it and pull out what you need to pull out of it. when I look at some of that information, a lot of organizations were definitely in the social services and health care. So that meant a lot of their departments completely closed down during COVID. So that made a lot of sense in that perspective. And that the other thing I found was very interesting was that approximately half were an organization that served a local community rather than a large region or a large national organization. So this is very grassroots data and very grassroots impact. So when I look at those pieces, I think that some things from volunteers, their uncertainties and are they coming back and what kind of roles are they going to have and what they can, what do they want to do from a volunteer management perspective. Volunteer managers are really going to have to look at how do they modify their roles in consideration with their volunteers, and maybe some of the existing roles just don't make sense anymore, or they just need to be modified depending on upon your volunteer needs and your organizational needs. So I know that some really good data from that piece. So anything to comment on that piece, Paula? What do you think?
Well, I think this really resonates with the comments that I've been hearing from various organizations, and I know the conversations we've had with our members, volunteer centers, and your members. This is actually an affirmation of some of the things that we've been hearing. Are there any questions that anyone's asked that Karen or Deb want to share with us?
I don't have a question at this stage, but an interesting comment from a participant from the UK who said that so many of these issues are the same in other countries. So that's good to hear. We are seeing that some consistency with surveys that have come in the previous months. Diana mentioned an Imagine Canada survey that was at the end of April that said about 54% of organizations were looking at transitioning their roles to virtual, and we found that that number is consistent 6 weeks later when our survey was fielded, and it sounds as if some of the issues that we've raised here are not just Canadian but are applicable all across the globe. So in some senses, I guess that's good. And we are hearing their consistency with what other organizations are hearing. And the comment is that the supply of volunteers continues to outweigh the demand. So we have been hearing that in some cases that some organizations are overwhelmed with applications, generous volunteers wanting to contribute their time, but not the volunteer roles in the moment to be able to accommodate all of that generosity. Question around how we're finding accommodating volunteers with various disabilities while doing virtual volunteering. That's an interesting question.
I mean, that one, Deb, I think is, you can have many different thoughts of it. Is it easier to accommodate now because we're all virtual volunteering in the last 9 weeks or so, or is it harder because you've got technology barriers? So there's other barriers that may exist because of the situation that we've got that maybe didn't exist beforehand. Definitely a challenge for organizations.
Mm-hmm. And I think that, as you said, in some cases, the technology does facilitate, but we're also looking to adapting existing technology so that it can facilitate in different ways that we hadn't thought of before.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. All right. So Deb Pike, who's the manager of our COVID response and worked alongside Ipsos on this research. Over to you, Deb, to share some of the results from what the volunteers had said.
Sure. Thanks, Paula, and thank you everyone for joining us today. And I echo my thanks to everyone who contributed to this data by completing the survey and circulating the survey. We very much appreciate that. As Diana said in her intro, this survey had 2 streams, and she presented some information about how the organizations responded to the questions that we posed to them. On a separate stream, we asked for information from volunteers. in an 8-minute survey. We were pleased to have responses from 604 volunteers. Again, those surveys were conducted online on an open link during that same time frame at the end of May. And as Diana noted, some of the calculations will be more than 100% just based on how they were able to respond to the questions. Interesting and we were pleased to have had responses all across the board, which makes for some interesting data and analysis as we go ahead. We hit every age range with the majority of our responses coming 48% from the age group of 35 to 64, and 24% of volunteers who responded were over the age of 65. Again, they were from across the country mostly, a little bit different distribution from the organizations in that we had a bit more heavily weighted in some provinces than others. For the volunteers, we were quite heavily weighted in Ontario, but we did have responses from across all of the areas of the country. Interestingly, we received fully 20% of responses from individuals who were not active volunteers prior to COVID. So we were pleased with that response. 80% were active volunteers, and we certainly expected to hear from them, but 20% who were not active. And in that category of non-active before COVID-19, some were volunteering for the first time because of COVID-19. Many had volunteered at some time in the past. So 27% who had volunteered in the past and were now volunteering again, but 28% who had volunteered in the past but were not able to find a volunteer position at this time. 5% were helping out in their neighborhood. Sorry, Paula. We're helping out in their neighborhood, and others weren't successful in their first attempt. From active volunteers, we had a range as well. Some who continued to volunteer in the same role, 31%, not surprisingly, who were not able to volunteer during this time for a range of reasons. Some who were in a new or adapted role with the same organization or volunteering with a new organization. And some who were not active because they weren't able to find a role in their during this time, and that same smaller percentage who helped out in their neighborhood. We also found that in terms of the types of organizations that volunteers were involved with, they mirrored quite consistently the types of organizations that responded to the survey. A large percentage in social services, in health, were the two main areas who responded to the survey. We did ask volunteers, active volunteers, those who were active before COVID, how their volunteering had changed compared to pre-March 2020. And among those who were active at least once a month pre-March, we found that all of the percentages and types of volunteering had declined, except for one. So active volunteering declined quite significantly, which we wouldn't be surprised to hear. And you can see the base of that in the I did not volunteer at this time, rounding out where those active volunteers were before. All the other types of volunteering declined. The one that stayed consistent was helping out in their neighborhoods, which I think is a great sign that people continue to contribute to community in a variety of ways, both through formal organizations and more informally in their neighborhoods. What inspired people to volunteer? We ask this question on almost every survey, and we get some consistent answers, and you won't be surprised to hear that contributing to community is the top answer. What's particular here is that the characteristic of understanding that there are some who are not able to volunteer during this time, so that was seemed to be an extra motivation for individuals, especially some who may not have volunteered before, to contribute at this time in order to make sure that they could, in some sense, cover off, knowing that there were many who could not contribute who would regularly do so. Consistent on most surveys that we see about why individuals volunteer is to use their skills and experience. And one that's particular to this pandemic with people having to stay at home is that we had many more individuals across all age groups who actually had more time to volunteer now, where they didn't have time before. And we saw that in some specific age groups where volunteerism was a little bit lower, and we are seeing that that had come because they have time now to be able to do it. Another piece that was interesting to us and that we will be looking at further is wanting to improve a sense of well-being or health. We know that volunteering has health benefits and benefits of well-being and contributing and connection, and this was a motivator for 37% of those who decided to contribute their time at this time. Next slide, Paula. Great. Though people are inspired and motivated to volunteer, especially during this time of pandemic, there would be some factors that would influence folks to be able to contribute and other factors that would deter people from volunteering during this time. What we saw on factors that help related to technology and time, again, reinforcing that people had time to volunteer. That number is pretty consistent with the percentage on the previous slide, that they had time to volunteer now, so that helped. And people who were comfortable and had access to technology felt that that was a great contributor, especially as you're seeing that would tie with the increase in number of virtual volunteering roles that we've been seeing during this time. But there were lots of factors that kept people away from volunteering, contributing to the decline in the number of volunteers that we have seen over time. And a lot of these relate to age and health vulnerabilities. So people who were over the age of 65 or living with someone over the age of 65, individuals who had their own health vulnerabilities, or again, were living with someone with health vulnerabilities, contributed highly to the reasons that they stepped away from volunteering at this time. Of interest to organizations was that there were still 17% of individuals who did not know where to find COVID-19 related volunteering opportunities, and 13% who didn't know how to help. So as hard as we try to be able to make our volunteering opportunities known, that's a good signal to all of us in organizations to keep that in mind when we are trying to promote the opportunities that we have available. Then we asked active volunteers how their volunteering had changed since COVID-19. We asked organizations the same question, and we saw that consistent with these numbers, organizations had said that 40% had suspended programs or reduced volunteer roles, and you can see here that consistent number of 39% of volunteers who said they had stopped completely volunteering. That could be one of the reasons. If there are no roles in your organization available, then perhaps it's those folks who had stepped away, and we know other reasons that they had stepped away from those roles. 20% of volunteers said their role has shifted and they were volunteering remotely now. And organizations said that over 50% were looking at transitioning or had transitioned some of their roles, if they could, to virtual opportunities. You can see from this survey that though organizations are working hard to do that, fewer are actually able to take advantage of those remote and virtual volunteering opportunities. We know that technology is one of the issues and the barriers for some volunteers in terms of being able to engage in virtual volunteering roles, so that may be one of the contributing factors to that difference and that gap that we're seeing between what organizations are trying to do in terms of moving to virtual and volunteers' ability to engage in those roles. We said that there were a number of high percentage of volunteers who were not able to volunteer at this time for a number of reasons, whether those are health related, not being able to find an opportunity, perhaps there are barriers of technology that are limiting them from being able to volunteer, or their organization's volunteer roles and programs have been suspended. But we wanted to know, okay, when we're ready to reopen, what does this mean? And many organizations were concerned, will those volunteers come back? And overwhelmingly, 84% of volunteers said, yes, we absolutely will come back. Either a definitive yes with no qualifiers, or as long as they are comfortable that health and safety practices would be in place, and that would make total sense during a pandemic. 84% said that they would want to return and are intending to return to volunteering after the pandemic. Now, we've been asked, all right, who are those volunteers? This sample size was a bit smaller, but we were able to take a look and know that this response was across all age groups. So all age groups responded that they would, yes, come back to volunteering. Most age 25 to 34 and 75 and older said, yes, they would. The ones who said, 12% said they were not sure if they would return, and 4% said no. In that category, again, we wanted to know who are the volunteers who had that unsure or response to say no. The no was highest amongst the age group of 25 to 34, and the I'm not sure, again, among the younger age groups. And why might that be? Well, we know that when we looked at folks' inspiration to volunteer, some of that was because they knew others could not. And if it was their first time volunteering or they had other commitments, those may be reasons that they would do it during this time. And we know we have many short-term and event-specific volunteers. There will always be individuals who in the midst of a crisis step up in that moment, and then other commitments that they had previous would come back into that and make it so that they would not have time to continue on a regular basis. So some folks said that it was indeed age and health concerns. Others said that there were other commitments that they had, whether they were going back to school or going back to work. We know that when volunteers said they had more time to volunteer, as communities and businesses open back up, some of those people will literally be going back to work. So the time that they had to commit to volunteering is now gone and taken up with other commitments. So it would make sense that some of those people would say no or not, they would not commit to volunteering in the future. We asked our first-time volunteers who were applying to volunteer positions for the first time about their experience. We wanted to hear how that experience is. We've been hearing a lot in the field about how that is going. For the experience, many of the volunteers, 56%, which is a very high number, submitted an application and had not heard back from the organization. And we know that there are organizations that are overwhelmed with volunteer applications. And we heard from Ruth earlier that some of the very folks who would be managing those volunteers have lost their positions. So we can see that that might be some of the reasons that that number would be high. What was encouraging to us to look at the rest of the data there, when we asked folks, okay, if you had not heard back, what were your next steps after that? 50% said they planned to check back later with the organization, which to me is encouraging because there's an understanding of a unique situation where folks wouldn't be able to perhaps respond in as timely a manner. 36% said they'd applied to volunteer with a different organization. And 30%, when we asked how they felt after not hearing back, said that they understood and they would try again later with that organization, which I think is a very good sign as well. Go to the next one. We were pleased on both surveys to have a lot of commentary, comments and questions that were submitted. I'm always thankful I find it's very rich information to hear from people who have the opportunity to just add some comments that are not a direct response to a question. So here are some of the comments that we received from the volunteers that align with some of the data that we heard. We heard that it felt great to volunteer when they knew other people had to step back. For some, it was very difficult to find positions because they had been suspended. There was some interesting comments about organizations. The organization has reconnected with its mission during the pandemic response and preparations for recovery. There is even greater sense of purpose in this work than usual. And I think that's very encouraging and grounding for those of us in the sector to hear that. We know that folks who are older with health issues were stepping away. It was uplifting to see I have virtual technology. And was able to use that technology, but knowing that some of his older friends, that person's older friends, may not have that same access. And the looking at shifting roles and people's and organizations' ability to pivot during this time. So some very encouraging responses and comments from volunteers during this time. Next slide.
Thank you so much, Deb. It's always a pleasure again to hear the person who's been involved in the research explain not just what the numbers show, but what's behind the numbers. So thank you so much, Deb. That was really, really informative. One of the things we wanted to know is how can we help? How can Volunteer Canada help, and how can volunteer centres continue to help support during the next few months and forward in terms of engaging volunteers. And so you could see here that people were very interested in the curating and development of adapted volunteer management resources and training. That was the top thing that was asked for, sharing information and updates, and raising awareness about volunteer engagement issues. We also heard about people's interest in bringing together stakeholder groups, nonprofits, organizations, and volunteer centers and businesses to share and collaborate, and information on our website. We also know that it's very important for us all to be together, for us all to recognize that each of us has expertise and experience that can be valuable to someone else. Sometimes it's across the country, sometimes it's in an organization that's totally different from ours, but it really is valuable. So we at Volunteer Canada, and I know our colleagues in local volunteer centers, have certainly found that bringing people together and sharing these experiences and resources has been one of the truly most beneficial things that we've seen, and we're committed to continuing that, absolutely. So just to summarize, and we'll entertain questions in a moment, but if you have any comments or questions that you want to get ready, please put them in the chat. As you can see, and no surprise to you because you're living it, the pandemic has had a disruptive force in all aspects of our life, including volunteering. And we did see a decrease in volunteering in many organizations, primarily because many activities, services, and programs were canceled, postponed, or adapted. We also heard from people of all ages who were not active volunteers before the pandemic. And as Deb was saying earlier, that was very gratifying for us to have the voices and experiences of those who were either trying to volunteer for the first time or hadn't volunteered in years and were coming back to it, and what their experience was. But half of those new volunteers were not successful in finding a volunteer opportunity. And although we saw that they were understanding, they were going to check back with the organization, still we feel that there's an opportunity for us as a sector to really think through how we handle surge volunteering and the beautiful generosity that is comes forward when we have crises such as these, and how do we make sure that people know we're appreciative of their gestures to come forward and help. The number of organizations that offered virtual volunteer opportunities quadrupled from before March to now, and interestingly enough, that many are planning to continue that. So that's an innovation or an adaptation that may have longer term benefits. Most volunteers taking leave, plan to return. Again, something really positive. There was concern about what would happen. And comfort and access to technology were significant factors for volunteers to be able to continue. So those were some of the things that we thought worth summarizing. Challenges here, planning for an uncertain future in terms of program adaptations. We don't know how long each phase, if we can call them phases, is going to take place and what the future will look like. Keeping volunteers engaged while they're on leave. That's something that's very important. Many organizations are concerned about volunteers who have been involved in their organization for years, for whom volunteering is a highlight and important part of feeling connected to community. And what is our responsibility as organizations to stay engaged and to check in on volunteers who are on leave. Responding to new volunteers, as I mentioned, improving access and comfort with technology, and supporting volunteers and organizations to re-engage those that have suspended programs that are now planning to reintroduce them and re-engage. How do we do that safely? How do we make people feel comfortable? And what does this tell us about volunteering? Well, again, people are generous and they are understanding, and organizations are innovative and resilient. So this was really a reaffirming survey that told us that yes, there's been challenges and yes, there will be more, but we've got many people willing to help out and many people willing to help each other in organizations. So with that, please feel free to put your questions or comments into the chat box. Does this resonate with you? Are there particular examples or ideas that you have for others on how to deal with some of the challenges we mentioned? Are there experiences that you have that are unique or different from this that you want to share? Please, please share that in the chat. I should also mention that, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Paula.
Just also reiterating that we are recording this and this will be available. As Ruth was saying, I know it's a lot to take in, and this is just the beginning of an important conversation. So, questions?
We do have a question about someone was hopeful there might be a slide that considers trends to responses to the important question at slide 24. For example, does the percentage of those who said they would return decline with the passage of time? So this survey would be a point of time survey. So this is what we learned now. We are planning a follow-up survey in September, understanding that we expect that this pandemic and these different phases of returning will carry on for quite some time. So you're quite right. Doing a second survey with some of the same questions will be able to give us some of that trending data, and that will be one of the questions that we'll be following for sure, and it's a very important one. Paula, Ruth, any other comments related to that?
It would definitely make in September to look at that piece, because we've been 6 months into it, and some organizations have come back. Some organizations haven't still yet. So it'll again just be a point in time. I found it really interesting on that slide, just looking at how many said yes and how many just weren't really sure based on where they were in that data to answer that question. So it'll be very interesting come September to see how that actually changes.
Some of the questions and comments that that were put in by organizations related to, and there's some questions in the chat, that's why I'm sharing this, around how do we plan for a future that is so uncertain. So some of the questions that organizations are struggling with included, what will volunteering look like as the pandemic continues and when we get to post-COVID-19? We don't really know yet. Will volunteer roles change? I think we've seen that some of them will. How will previous volunteers fit in with new and adapted roles? And that was a concern that folks had. Are we going to be able to find roles What do we do when we're talking about engaging volunteers? Organizations are thinking about the inactive volunteers who were previously active, the new volunteers who've come to your organization. There's a question there about how are organizations dealing with the new individuals who have not previously had contact or volunteered with their organizations before. How are they working at connecting them and keeping them connected to their organization? Will all of the programs resume? Will all the volunteers be able to return? And the question there was very interesting because it's not just the volunteer's choice. It may be that an organization may have more limited capacity to engage volunteers. And then how do you deal with the decisions related to which volunteers will come back in which roles? What does that look like? So there are a lot of questions that are being posed in the chat that were also posed, and know that organizations are thinking and working on these. It was encouraging to see that 58% of organizations were working on their plans to re-engage operationally and re-engage their volunteers. And these are all of the pieces and questions that folks are thinking about. You'll notice on the slide where it asked organizations, how can organizations like Volunteer Centers and Volunteer Canada continue to support? One of the ones that was important was those connections to each other and engaging stakeholders. And we have found, I know Paula leads, and Allison and Karen lead the Volunteer Centers and the Corporate Council and our membership. And there's such great energy there from learning from each other and posing these questions and working together through these kinds of questions. So we know these are things that we're working on together and anticipate doing over the next quite a while, I think.
That's a good point, Deb, because I know from Volunteer Management Professionals of Canada, we've had our I call them connect calls since COVID started, and it is all about communications, all about relating to others, asking those questions, trying to figure out what they can do and also what they can do to support now and in future. So I think that is probably the biggest thing when I think about organizations, to make sure that not only are the organizations communicating with their clients or their patrons or customers, but also that the volunteer managers are sitting at the tables and having those conversations, even if they don't know the answer, to just kind of work through it and just tackle some things. This is very unprecedented times, right? And who knows whether there's another wave coming back, or who knows where this actually goes. In the volunteer sector, there's often an awful lot of uncertainty. And so I think it's just now more apparent of how much uncertainty there is, but we've always had reduced funding or reduced resources or reduced many different things in the volunteer sector. So we're very resilient, and I think the staff are very resilient, and volunteer centers are very resilient, and we tend to react back to it and just make it all go better and go forward.
One of the things that came up a few weeks ago when we co-presented with Statistics Canada on the General Social Survey of Giving, Volunteering and Participating was the focus on informal volunteering. Those people who are helping out family, friends, and neighbors outside their household. And we have heard that this has very much been the case during the pandemic. And that's not a bad thing, that perhaps given the challenges and risks and liabilities and all the other issues related to programs being closed and suspended and postponed, that people are still finding ways to help one another. People are getting active in their neighborhoods and are reaching out and checking in with family, friends, and neighbors that they know. And that is something that we will see more of. We have seen more of over the last 5-6 years, the trend towards a different balance, a slight decrease in formal volunteering and an increase and recognition of the importance of informal volunteering. So as organizations, our challenge can be, how do we connect with that? How do we celebrate that? And how do we find some way to support that as well? Are there other comments or questions?
Absolutely, there are lots. I'm sifting through. There's a question about virtual volunteering, and are there resources for volunteer managers on virtual volunteering? And this is an area where there are many organizations, centers, and Volunteer Canada developing resources on that topic to support volunteer managers and to support volunteers. So on our website at Volunteer Canada, we do have a tab on virtual volunteering with some resources there, and also our resource page. We have a specific page for resources under different categories related to adaptations and information on the impact of COVID-19, specifically on volunteer engagement. We know that many other organizations have different topic areas related to the impact of COVID on the broader organization. We tried to focus ours on volunteer engagement so that when you come to our site, that's what you will find. There is a tab there on virtual volunteering. It includes information and resources from Volunteer Canada, from volunteer centers. There's some training modules there from Volunteer Toronto. There are some other resources from other volunteer centers and from other organizations across the globe who have done some good work and provided some resources on virtual volunteering. And you will be seeing more, because this trend is something that has increased and will stay consistently. You will be seeing more information on managing virtual volunteers and supporting not virtual volunteers, I've misspoken. Volunteers in virtual roles. They are not virtual individuals.
Real people.
Correct. Yes, they're real people. Yeah. There was a question around advocacy. How will Volunteer Canada and others use this data and this survey information to advocate for the role of volunteering? And there were a couple of questions around that, Paula.
Good question. So one of the things that this pandemic has illuminated has been the importance of volunteers and the importance of nonprofit organizations and their role in community. And I think that there have been very few times in the past where there has been such a focus on what we do as a sector and the important role that what volunteers play. We've seen governments in provinces and territories and regions come up with strategies to mobilize and engage volunteers. We've seen organizations being supported to increase their capacity to engage volunteers. We've also seen some misunderstandings about what the infrastructure and the expertise and the professionalism involved in engaging volunteers. So this is definitely a moment. We will continue to speak up about that. And one of the things that the network of volunteer centers has been working on is some advocacy work on the importance of volunteers and the role that professionals and volunteer centers play in facilitating volunteer engagement. So I think you're absolutely right. This is a moment for us to really leverage that.
A very interesting comment here around developing volunteer roles. And we're talking about adaptations to volunteer roles and the work that it takes to go into doing that work and transitioning and developing new. And the comment here is that this might be a good time to reevaluate all existing roles to see what are meaningful, which ones are meaningful moving forward, and pivot from those that are simply historic. It's important to look at good measures for new high impact roles. And I think that's always good advice for all of us. I think we're all reminded that all the roles and the work of organizations should support and move its mission forward. So that is a good reminder that in this time when we are looking at volunteer roles, to make sure they're meaningful. Question here around how will we engage seniors that won't be able to come back, especially when those seniors were using volunteering to prevent social isolation and by extension may now be feeling isolated themselves. Paula, do you want to take that one?
Sure. One of the things you saw that Diana presented was, how are organizations connecting with volunteers, and many organizations are making efforts to either organize events, email, contact, connect volunteers to one another. And Diana, I believe that came up in the research earlier on. And I think that the fear or the worry that older adult volunteers who aren't volunteering will feel socially isolated in the more classical sense is something that many social services are starting to think about. So organizations that serve older adults have been thinking about what to do, including using technology, but in other ways, and even providing tools and resources to family members on how to ensure that extended family can check in and do innovative things. I've seen some of that in local communities.
We have another question, a comment from someone who says they've experienced a spike in corporate volunteerism. How does this affect the long-term trend in corporations allowing their staff to be involved in community? And is there any data on this? So Paula, I'm going to give that one right to you.
Oh, good timing. Well, we are about to launch another survey of businesses next week on how they are contributing to community and different practices around employee volunteering. And like everyone else, there was a period of time where businesses were simply adapting to the new reality. In addition to that, there was concerns about risk and liability to encourage employees to volunteer in person. And then as the sector was retooling itself and trying to develop virtual roles, that's when many businesses have started to connect with some of those opportunities, but it is taking time, that's for sure.
I think we're going to leave it there for now. We have just a few minutes to, Paula, I'll leave that to you to wrap up.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ruth, I know that you connect with your members regularly who are professionals in volunteer management and engagement. And Diana, we hope to do more with you, in this field, and really, really appreciate all the expertise and insights. Is there anything that surprised you about the research when you were working with us and when you got the results? Oh, and you will have to unmute you. There we go.
Sorry, I don't think that I think what's surprising, I guess if you're not working in the field, is how much people are engaging, as you said, with those who weren't able to volunteer, and it's like they're not being forgotten because they're not able to do it at the current time. And I think it just speaks to the sector of how, you need compassionate people to work in this sector. And I think a lot of the results show that that compassion is there, and this idea of working together, of exchanging ideas and information so that you can sort of weather this pandemic and all the things, the challenges it is raised, that you can do that. And I think that's always great for you to find out, but it's great for someone like me as a researcher to see that well, at least not just in Canada, but it's happening around the world, where people are really trying to reach out to others and seeing how many people are involved in their community that are not doing, as you say, just sort of regular volunteer work, but just seeing that people have a need and serving that need. I think it's so refreshing to see that kind of thing, because all we ever see in the news media is all the negatives about COVID, but I think there's some positives that have come out of COVID. We can, and definitely these results show that there are positives and things that will make you think about the future of volunteerism and how it can look and how it can be shaped to deal with if this kind of thing ever happens again. Or even if it doesn't, it's probably shown you different roles that your volunteers can play and how they can be engaged without actually even being physically there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Ruth, any final thoughts before we end?
From the profession of volunteer management, I mean, talking to the number of folks I've talked to in the last 3 months, the ability, flexibility, willingness, desire to just get and figure out how they're going to do this. So moving to different options, finding out how their different programs can work, how they can modify, how they can adjust them. So this, like Diana said, the sector's strong, The volunteerism is strong, but so is the people behind the scenes and in front of the scenes driving this. So I think the information was great, and really look forward to the next piece of this.
Mhm. Well, I want to once again express my appreciation to Ipsos Public Affairs, to the Volunteer Management Professionals of Canada for partnering with us, to Employment and Social Development Canada for supporting this research, and to Deb Pike for leading and ushering and really driving this research in a way that was really inclusive of all folks in our sector. And to all of you who have completed and circulated and taken an interest in this work, my heroes continue to be, aside from volunteers who are so generous with their giving, the professionals who manage and engage volunteers and local volunteer centers who are in every community just doing amazing work, engaging volunteers and seeing us through this. So thank you very much. As you can see, you can follow up with any additional questions. Here's the information where you can reach us. We will circulate the recording of the presentation, and you will see lots on our website and on the sites of local volunteer centers and volunteer management professionals of Canada to help us through this. Take care. Bye. Merci.